Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
News at 4 o'clock. I'm Kay Burley. Our top stories for you. Pressure on Putin as the world follows Britain expelling more than 100 Russian diplomats. Moscow says the coordinated move by more than a dozen countries in response to the Salisbury attack is a mistake. The United States alone expels 60 Russians from Washington. Going to be live in the United States, Ukraine and Moscow as the Prime Minister prepares to address the Commons. And in Salisbury, where Sky sources say that public buildings will be decontaminated this week. A very good afternoon. Russian diplomats across the world have heard they're to be expelled from their bases and sent back to Moscow. In a coordinated move, America, Germany, France, Poland and many more announced that officials would be given their marching orders over the Salisbury nerve agent attack. The Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson described the action as an extraordinary international response. The Kremlin says it's a mistake. I should give you the latest breakdown of the countries involved. It's changing all the time, but this is the latest that we can bring to you as far as the USA is concerned. They have expelled a staggering 60 diplomats from the country, most of them from Washington State, is what we're told. It comes after the UK expelled 23 diplomats earlier on this month. In Eastern Europe, Ukraine, hearing from Ukraine that they have expelled 13 diplomats. They're going to be made to leave. Germany has said that they will expel 4 diplomats. Looking at Germany, 4 diplomats going from Germany. France, same number from France. And as far as Poland is concerned, following suit, 4 number as well. Meantime, Lithuania has said they will expel 3 diplomats. That's also been the response from the Czech Republic. 3 diplomats going from the Czech Republic. The Netherlands heard from them in the last hour. 2 Russian diplomats are off. Italy also plans to expel a further 2 individuals, is what we're hearing. What about Denmark? Well, they're expelling 2 diplomats as well. Latvia, they're going to expel 1. Estonia also planning to expel 1 diplomat. For now, Finland has just announced plans to expel a Russian diplomat. Croatia, same number. Finally, not just EU countries that are taking action. Canada, we have heard as well. They are expelling 4 diplomats too. And Sweden and Romania just confirmed that they are both expelling 1 diplomat each. European Council President Donald Tusk has said a total of 14 EU member states will expel Russian diplomats. This is what he had to say within the last few moments.
As a direct follow-up to last week's European Council decision to react to Russia within a common framework, already today 14 member states have decided to expel Russian diplomats. Additional measures, including further expulsions within the common EU framework, are not to be excluded in the coming days and weeks.
Well, our correspondents standing by in America and Russia. In a moment, we're going to be speaking to John Sparks in Moscow, Stuart Ramsey in Ukraine. But first, let's go live to Washington. And our US correspondent going to the Ukraine, just establishing communication there. But let's bring in Mark Austin, first of all, should we? Hello to you. Mark, 60 diplomats on their way home very soon.
Yes, Boris Johnson's right. It is an extraordinary show of international resolve, certainly an extraordinary show of American resolve, given the nature of Vladimir Putin's relationship with Donald Trump. Yes, 60 diplomats being expelled, 48 from the embassy here in Washington, 12 from the UN. And then there's this interesting side to all this over in Seattle. They're closing the Russian consulate in Seattle, not for any specific intelligence reason, we're told, but just because of its proximity close to a big American submarine base and the Boeing aircraft manufacturers. They're over there as well. So very strong action from Donald Trump. They've been given 7 days, the Russians and their families, to leave the United States. Intelligence officials are right now briefing Congress on the reasons behind these dismissals, the expulsions of these diplomats. Interestingly, Donald Trump spoke to President Putin last week. That was to congratulate him on his election victory. That caused no end of controversy here. We're told he hasn't picked up the phone to President Putin at all on the issue of these diplomats. He's left it to go through normal diplomatic channels through the State Department. But we've certainly had, Kay, the strongest condemnation of the Russians from the White House in the term of this administration. They're talking about it being a response to Russia's use of military-grade chemical weapons on the soil of the United Kingdom, the latest in its ongoing pattern of destabilizing activities around the world. And then it says, with these steps, the United States and our allies make clear to Russia that its actions will have consequences. So unexpectedly strong action from Donald Trump. The one interesting thing, I think, now is whether the United States will impose much tougher sanctions on Russia, not necessarily as a result of the Salisbury attack, but as a result of the meddling in the election in 2016. Many people here in Congress want tougher sanctions. They want to hit the energy sector and the defense sector of the Russian regime. It remains to be seen whether Donald Trump will impose those sanctions, but it is being talked about here in Washington today.
OK, thank you. Let's bring in Stuart Ramsey, standing by in the Ukraine. Come to you in just a second, if you, gentlemen, because I just wanted to take you straight to the House of Commons. We're hearing from the Prime Minister talking about Russia.
Digital companies. All of these are issues on which the UK will play a leading role in our future partnership with the EU after we have left. And this Council also took important steps towards building that future partnership. First, on Russia, we are shortly to debate the threat that Russia poses to our national security, and I will set this out in detail then. But at this Council, I shared the basis for our assessment that Russia was responsible for the reckless and brazen attempted murder of Sergei and Yulia Skripal in Salisbury, and the exposure of many others to potential harm. All EU leaders agreed, and as a result, the Council conclusions were changed to state that the Council, quote, agrees with the United Kingdom government's assessment that it is highly likely that the Russian Federation is responsible and that there is no alternative plausible explanation. Mr. Speaker, this was the first offensive use of a nerve agent on European soil since the foundation of the EU and NATO. It is a clear violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention and, as an unlawful use of force, a clear breach of the UN Charter. It is part of a pattern of increasingly aggressive Russian behaviour, but also represents a new and dangerous phase in Russia's hostile activity against Europe and our shared values and interests. So I argued that there should be a reappraisal of how our collective efforts can best tackle the challenge that Russia poses following President Putin's re-election. And in my discussions with President Macron and Chancellor Merkel, as well as other leaders, we agreed on the importance of sending a strong European message in response to Russia's actions, not just out of solidarity with the UK, but recognising the threat posed to the national security of all EU countries. So the Council agreed immediate actions, including withdrawing the EU's ambassador from Moscow. And today, 18 countries have announced their intention to expel more than 100 Russian intelligence officers from their countries. This includes 15 EU member states, as well as the United States, Canada and the Ukraine. And this is the largest collective expulsion of Russian intelligence officers in history. I have found great solidarity from our friends and partners in the EU, North America, NATO and beyond over the past 3 weeks as we have confronted the aftermath of the Salisbury incident. And together we have sent a message that we will not tolerate Russia's continued attempts to flout international law and undermine our values. European nations will also act to strengthen their resilience to chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear-related risks, as well as bolstering their capabilities to deal with hybrid threats. We also agreed that we would review progress in June, with foreign ministers being tasked to report back ahead of the next Council. Mr. Speaker, the challenge of Russia is one that will endure for years to come. As I've made clear before, we have no disagreement with the Russian people who have achieved so much through their country's great history. Indeed, our thoughts are with them today in the aftermath of the awful shopping centre fire in Kemerovo in Siberia. But President Putin's regime is carrying out acts of aggression against our shared values and interests within our continent and beyond. And as a sovereign European democracy, the United Kingdom will stand shoulder to shoulder with the EU and with NATO to face down these threats together. Turning to the United States' decision to impose import tariffs on steel and aluminium, the Council was clear that these measures cannot be justified on national security grounds and that sector-wide protection in the US is an inappropriate remedy for the real problems of overcapacity. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for International Trade, travelled to Washington last week to argue for an EU-wide exemption. So we welcome the temporary exemption that has now been given to the European Union, but we must work hard to ensure this becomes permanent. At the same time, we will continue to support preparations in the EU to defend our industry in a proportionate manner in compliance with WTO rules. Turning to Brexit, last week the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union reached agreement with the European Commission negotiating team on large parts of the draft withdrawal agreement. This includes the reciprocal agreement on citizens' rights, the financial settlement, aspects of issues relating to Northern Ireland, such as the common travel area, and crucially the detailed terms of a time-limited implementation period running to the end of December 2020. I am today placing copies of the draft agreement in the House libraries, and I want to thank the Secretary of State and our negotiating team for all their work in getting us to this point. The Council welcomed the agreement reached, including the time that the implementation period will provide for governments, businesses and citizens on both sides to prepare for the new relationship we want to build. As I set out in my speech in Florence, it is not in our national interest to ask businesses to undertake two sets of changes. So it follows that during the implementation period, they should continue to trade on current terms. Whilst I recognise that not everyone will welcome continuation of current trading terms for another 21 months, such an implementation period has been widely welcomed by British business because it is necessary if we are to minimise uncertainty and deliver a smooth and successful Brexit. For all of us, the most important issue must be focusing on negotiating the right future relationship that will endure for years to come. And we are determined to use the implementation period to prepare properly for that future relationship, which is why it is essential that we have clarity about the terms of that relationship when we ask the House to agree the implementation period and the rest of the withdrawal agreement in the autumn. Mr. Speaker, there are of course some key questions that remain to be resolved on the withdrawal agreement, including the governance of the agreement and how our commitments to avoid a hard border between Ireland and Northern Ireland should be turned into legal text. As I have made clear, we remain committed to the agreement we reached in December in its entirety. This includes a commitment to agree operational legal text for the backstop option set out in the joint report, although it remains my firm belief that we can and will find the best solutions for Northern Ireland as part of the overall future relationship between the UK and the EU. I have explained that the specific European Commission proposals for that backstop were unacceptable because they were not in line with the Belfast Agreement and threatened the break-up of the UK's internal market. And as such, they were not a fair reflection of the joint report. But there are many issues on which we can agree with the Commission, and we are committed to working intensively to resolve those which remain outstanding. So I welcome that we are beginning a dedicated set of talks today with the European Commission and, where appropriate, the Irish Government, so that we can work together to agree the best way to fulfil the commitments we have made. We have also been working closely with the Government of Gibraltar to ensure that Gibraltar is covered by our EU negotiations on withdrawal, the implementation period and future relationship. I am pleased that the draft agreement published jointly last week correctly applies to Gibraltar, but we will continue to engage closely with the Government of Gibraltar and our European partners to resolve the particular challenges our EU withdrawal poses for Gibraltar and for Spain. Mr. Speaker, following my speeches in Munich and at the Mansion House, setting out the future security and economic partnerships we want to develop, the Council also agreed guidelines for the next stage of the negotiations on this future relationship, which must rightly now be our focus. While there are, of course, some clear differences between our initial positions, the guidelines are a useful starting point for the negotiations that will now get underway. And I welcome the Council restating the EU's determination to have as close as possible a partnership with the UK and its desire for a balanced, ambitious and wide-ranging free trade agreement. For I believe there is now an opportunity to create a new dynamic in these negotiations. The agreements our negotiations have reached on the withdrawal agreement and the implementation period are proof that with political will and with a spirit of cooperation and a spirit of opportunity for the future, We can find answers to difficult issues together, and we must continue to do so. For whether people voted leave or remain, many are frankly tired of the old arguments and the attempts to refight the referendum over the past year. With a year to go, people are coming back together and looking forward. They want us to get on with it, and that's what we're going to do. And I commend this statement to the House.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for the advanced sight of the statement, and I join her in condemning the appalling terrorist attack in Trèbes and offering our solidarity with the French government and the people of France, and our condolences to the family of Lieutenant Colonel Beltrame, the hero of the siege. She's right to commend the heroic action of police and security services, both here and in France, and to mark the one-year anniversary of the killing of PC Keith Palmer and others on Westminster Bridge, who were quite properly remembered last Thursday in Westminster Hall and in St Mary Undercroft. On Russia, I welcome the international consensus that the Prime Minister has built. As I said 2 weeks ago, the most powerful response we can make is multilateral action. So I'd like to place on record our thanks to the EU and other states for their cooperation with us. I know we'll discuss these issues further later this afternoon, but I would also add my condolences to all those Russian families affected by the Komrovo shopping centre fire at the weekend. On US steel tariffs, we need a coordinated response to tackle the dumping of steel by some nations and to resist the retreat into protectionism by the United States. The temporary respite from tariffs is welcome, but we must make it permanent. Mr. Speaker, we're pleased that some progress seems to have been made on the transition period, especially given the agreement is identical to what Labour was calling for last summer. The only real question is why it took the government so long to realise that a transition on the same terms is vital to protect jobs and our economy. The government wasted months and months dithering and posturing before accepting the inevitable. This, Mr. Speaker, is the consistent pattern of these Brexit talks. Wild claims and red lines quickly become climb-downs and broken promises. Our coastal and fishing communities were told by the Environment Secretary only this month that the Prime Minister has been clear Britain will leave the Common Fisheries Policy as of March 2019. Just a few weeks later, we find out this won't be the case. And what about when we were told by the Brexit Secretary the government would deliver the exact same benefits of the single market and the customs union? Well, now the Prime Minister is saying we won't be able to have the benefits of the single market. And after saying it was a viable option early this year, any form of customs union is now ruled out too. Mr. Speaker, in January we were told by the Prime Minister that EU citizens arriving during the transition period would not get the same rights as those already in the UK. She said, and I quote, "I'm clear there is a difference between those who came prior to us leaving and those who will come when they know the UK is leaving." Now she's clear there is no difference. The insecurity for families and businesses and the confusion at the heart of government has dogged the first phase of the negotiations. So, Mr. Speaker, can the Prime Minister today give some clarity and confirm that we will not withdraw from the European Nuclear Agreement, Euratom, until alternative international arrangements for nuclear cooperation are agreed? Will her government back those pragmatic amendments to the Nuclear Safeguards Bill? The Prime Minister had previously signalled there would be flexibility over the duration of the transition period. Yet, in the withdrawal agreement, the government has accepted a definitive withdrawal date of December 2020. Can the Prime Minister explain what happened to a request for flexibility? And what is the government doing to ensure that this date could be extended if a deal has not been reached? Mr. Speaker, it's been broken promise after broken promise, and I can only hope the next broken promise doesn't involve their commitment to no hard border in Ireland. The government has still offered no credible solution to this. And now, in order to move negotiations on, the Prime Minister has been forced into an agreement that could result in a hard border in the Irish Sea. So can the Prime Minister outline how she will prevent a hard border in Ireland or in the Irish Sea if she rules out any form of customs union? Many UK nations and regions have benefited from the European Investment Bank. Given that we are still paying into the EU budget, can the Prime Minister explain why the UK won't be eligible for any new funding during transition? Doesn't that leave us still paying in, but to get less? Mr. Speaker, has the Prime Minister signed up to there being an Anglo-Spanish bilateral agreement on Gibraltar? And can she tell the House who will lead the negotiations for the government? Mr. Speaker, last week the government presided over a new fiasco over passports. At her last Brexit statement, the Prime Minister told this House, "We're delivering to the British people and we're going to make a success of it." Well, tell that to De La Rue workers in Gateshead. It seems her red, white and blue Brexit has become the blue, white and red of the flag of France. Time after time, the Tories sell off British assets and jobs to the lowest bidder. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister says last week was a significant breakthrough, but this is the same breakthrough we were told had been signed off in December, and some of it is still fudged 4 months on. Yet we know the hardest decisions are yet to come. In the second phase of these talks, the government must stop posturing, drop the impossible lines, and finally put jobs and our economy first and give workers and businesses the clarity they need.
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, the right honourable gentleman raised the issue of steel. And I agree, as I said in my statement, and as I said at the European Union Council, we want to work with the EU in talking to the United States to make that temporary exemption from those tariffs for the EU into a permanent exemption. There is a need, as I referenced and as the right honourable gentleman did, for us to deal with the question of overcapacity in the steel market, and that is best dealt with in multilateral fora. That is why at the G20 in 2016 a forum was set up, including China, to sit around the table, and the work of that forum should continue, and we need to address that issue in that multilateral stage. He raised various other issues. On relation to Euratom, he will know that the membership of Euratom is legally linked to membership of the European Union, but we are putting in place the arrangements necessary to ensure that we can continue to operate with others in that particular area. He talked about clarity on citizens' rights. Actually, the December joint report and today's the report on the implementation period agreed last Friday do precisely that. They provide clarity for citizens as to what their rights are going to be. He referenced once again the Northern Ireland border, and we're very clear. We have set out proposals. We've set out ways in which that we can ensure there is no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. But we're also very clear in the December joint report, which was signed up to by both the United Kingdom and the European Union, that there should be no hard border down the Irish Sea. Effectively, the internal market of the United Kingdom should be retained, and that all aspects of the Belfast Agreement should be respected, and we continue to do that. He talks about the fact that the implementation period was a Labour Party idea. Can I just remind the right honourable gentleman of two things. First of all, the concept of that smooth and orderly withdrawal from Brexit was first referenced by my speech in Lancaster House in January 2017. And secondly, I seem to remember that the day after the referendum result in 2016, the right honourable gentleman wanted to trigger Article 50 immediately. No, no suggestion of an implementation period then, was there? So there we go. Finally, he talks about changes of opinion. This is the leader of the opposition who says he wants us to continue to be in a customs union, but at the same time refuses to accept the competition policy which is a necessary element of being in the customs union. It's the right honourable gentleman who, when the Shadow Home Secretary backed a rerun of the referendum, kept her in her job. When the then Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary backed a rerun of the referendum, he was sacked. So I say to the right honourable gentleman, it is this Conservative Party in government that is getting on delivering on the wishes of the British people and delivering a Brexit that works for everyone.
Mr. Ian Duncan Smith.
Mr. Speaker, may I commend my right honourable friend for her strong stance over the Russian attacks over the last couple of weeks. That strong stance has shown to the rest of the world that first you take action and you point the finger when you have the evidence, but you make sure you do not have a never-ending dialogue, as was recommended by the Leader of the Opposition, with those that would harm you most. Can I ask her whether she has taken further steps in those councils last week to recommend to the Germans that they look again at this pipeline directly to Russia?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can tell my right honourable friend that obviously it's very important that we're very clear-sighted when we deal with states like Russia and recognise the threat that they pose. The subject of the pipeline of Nord Stream 2 was not raised in the European Union Council. We have, of course, asked, in terms of further measures that might be taken by the European Union, we've asked the European Union foreign ministers to look at issues that might need to be addressed in June, and the EU Council will be looking again at this in June.
Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of her statement. I would like to start by wishing Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey and his family the very best following his discharge from hospital last week, and pay tribute to the NHS staff who cared for him in such difficult circumstances. And of course our thoughts remain with Yulia and Sergei Skripal. I also want to associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister and the terrorist atrocity in Treb and the selfless sacrifice of Lieutenant Colonel Arnaud Bertrand, and of course pay tribute to those that have been caught up in the terrible fire in Kemerovo in Siberia. Last week, the Prime Minister secured an important message in the European Council's formal declaration that it is highly likely Russia was behind the nerve agent attack in Salisbury earlier this month. I note that the EU leaders also agreed to recall Markus Ederer, the bloc's ambassador to Moscow, for consultations. This is a strong position our friends have taken, and I welcome united efforts in responding to the reckless chemical attack in Salisbury. Can the Prime Minister tell the House what discussions she has had with European partners in ensuring that non-governmental organisations on the ground in Russia continue to have the support of the United Kingdom and the European Union? Mr. Speaker, whilst the SNP welcomed the Prime Minister's statement on the 14th of March, we want to see firm action taken by the Government on Scottish limited partnerships, which are often used by criminals for money laundering. We also want action on the Majinsky amendments to the Sanctions and Money Laundering Bill. Can the Prime Minister confirm when we can expect to see her Government's plans to clamp down on Scottish limited partnerships and more generally to deal with all forms of Russian money laundering? Mr. Speaker, turning to the EU Council's conclusions on the latest phase of Brexit negotiations, will the Prime Minister tell the House what representations she made to EU leaders to reverse the conclusions on the UK's fishing rights post-Brexit? Last week, fishing communities across Scotland were left in the dark as their industry was bargained away by this Government. Why were the Secretary of State for Scotland and Ruth Davidson permitted to issue a statement on the 11th of March that would have control of our fishing grounds for this to be reversed only a week later? What changed? Did the Secretary of State know what was to happen? Had he been properly informed by the Government? It is incumbent on the Prime Minister that their rights are secured, and she rejects any deal that leaves fishing communities hamstrung in the transition agreement. Mr. Speaker, members on these benches continue to hold concerns about the UK Government's approach to the Good Friday Agreement in the Irish border. Time is running out The Prime Minister cannot play fast and loose with Northern Ireland any longer. Decisions are needed to give businesses and communities in Northern Ireland the certainty that their day-to-day lives deserve. And finally, can I ask the Prime Minister what discussions she has had with the Prime Minister of Spain of the ongoing situation between Spain and Catalonia and the arrest warrants that have been issued for democratically elected politicians, including those that are living in Scotland? Surely it's a political solution and not the situation that Spain are trying to impose on directly elected politicians.
Can I first of all join the right honourable gentleman in wishing the very best, as I'm sure everybody, as he says in this House does, to Nick Bailey and his family as he completes his recovery, and also to thank the NHS staff who have been, who not only treated him, but who also continue to care for Sergei and Yulia Skripal. I was very pleased to meet some of those staff when I was in Salisbury, just over very clear. He's raised a number of issues. On the question of action on Magnitsky, we have had discussions, I believe, with the right honourable gentleman, with the SNP and others about what an amendment might look like in relation to that. We'd already taken some action, but we're looking at making sure that we take the strongest possible action. And of course, one of the subjects that was raised by a number of my colleagues in the EU Council was their own Magnitsky legislation, and looking at that particular issue. On SLPs, if I may, I will write to the right honourable gentleman, because we have already looked at taken some action in this area, but are looking further at what we might be able to do. He raised the issue of Catalonia, and can I say we continue to believe that we wish to see the rule of law upheld, and we wish to ensure that the Spanish Constitution is upheld. On Northern Ireland, we continue, as I say, there are talks starting today with the European Commission on the details of the ways in which we will be able to ensure there is no hard border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, and where appropriate, those talks will also involve the Irish government. And finally, he talks about the common fisheries policy. Well, we will be leaving the common fisheries policy. We will be ensuring that we are taking back control of our waters. But I think it's a bit rich, him making those comments, coming from a party that wants to stay in the CFP in perpetuity.
The European guidelines of the 23rd of March and the EU proposed legal protocol both insist on the autonomy of the EU legal order and the jurisprudence of the European Court of Justice. Will my right honourable friend give the House an absolute assurance that the government in these negotiations will not accept exclusive or sole jurisdiction of the European Court over the UK from the 29th of March 2019, nor after the 30th of December 2020 at the end of the implementation period, and that the government will not enter a treaty or introduce legislation which confers such jurisdiction and which a recently retired European Court judge said would be a legal viper's nest.
Can I say to my honourable friend that, as I have said before in this chamber in response to a question from our honourable friend, the member for North East Somerset, during the implementation period, because we will be continuing to operate on the same, on largely the same basis as currently, then of course there will continue to be that role for the European Court of Justice. Once we leave, once we've ended the implementation period, it will be a very different story, and we will be absolutely in the position that I know my honourable friend wants of taking back control of our laws. Of course, there are some issues still to be addressed, as I referenced in my statement, on the withdrawal agreement, for example, the governance of that agreement, but there are a number of interesting ideas that have been proposed which do not give sole authority to the European Court of Justice, and that is not something we would want to see.
Yvette Cooper.
The Prime Minister's welcome remarks about European cooperation on Russia show the continued importance of cooperation with the EU after Brexit.
Absolutely.
And she has rightly proposed a security treaty to be in place by the end of the transition on extradition, Europol and data sharing. But she will also know that a new treaty could take 18 months for other countries to ratify, could yet be referred to the Court of Justice, and will have to deal with some tricky legal and and constitutional issues, for example on extradition, that Norway's taken over a decade to still try to resolve. So why is there no fallback clause in the withdrawal agreement? Why has she set a hard deadline of December 2020? And what will she do if the security treaty isn't in place in time?
Good question. Very good.
Can I say to the Right Honourable Lady that we are absolutely ready for starting those negotiations with the European Union in relation to that security partnership and in relation to that treaty for the future. We think it is actually in both sides' interests to have that treaty in place, and so far that has been the very clear message that I've had from our European partners, and I think they will have every intention, as we do, of ensuring that those security arrangements are in place at the time that we end the implementation period.
Redwood.
Given the very strong mood in the country to just get on with Brexit, will the government now produce its draft legislation to have the new fishing policy, the new farming policy, the new spending policies and, above all, the new borders policies, which will represent the Brexit bonus that we're all waiting for?
Can I say to my right honourable friend, he's covered a number of issues there. He will know DEFRA are indeed consulting on what would replace the Common Agricultural Policy. They will be consulting with the fishing industry and others on what would replace the Common Fisheries Policy. And, of course, there will be legislation coming forward as necessary to cover all the issues that we need to address before we see the end of the implementation period and have in place the future relationship.
Ms Winson.
Speaker, I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of her statement and welcome the joint statement that she secured from EU leaders on Russia and indeed the actions of those 18 countries today. It is exactly that kind of internationalist approach that we need. The Prime Minister mentioned the discussions on taxing digital companies whose behaviour as guardians of our data is of course subject of increasing concern. Does the Prime Minister agree that Brexit or no Brexit, the UK's only hope of tackling the massive and damaging monopoly power of the likes of Google, Facebook and Amazon is to work closely with our European partners on a coordinated approach not only on tax but on data protection and competition regulation as well?
Well, can I say to the Honourable Lady that, of course, we are looking, as part of our negotiations with the European Union, at the issues around data. That's another area where we want, of course, we're bringing the GDPR into UK legislation, but it's another area where we want to ensure we have a good arrangement for data exchange in the future. On the tax issue, there is, of course, work in hand at an international level, at the OECD level, on this question of digital companies and their taxation. And we believe that the best result is an international result, but we think it is right to look at, as the European Union, at whether there are any interim steps that need to be taken to ensure that we are properly taxing these companies.
Sir Roger Gale.
Flowing from her opening remarks, will my right honourable friend call upon the Secretary-General of the Council of Europe, the President of the Parliamentary Assembly, Michele Nicoletti, and the Assembly itself to join the British delegation in condemning utterly the actions of a Russian Federation that are wholly unacceptable in a civilised society?
I thank my honourable friend for that suggestion. I'm very happy to join him and to join the British delegation in making that request.
Okay, Harry.
Can I congratulate the Prime Minister on getting that unanimity on the question of Russia? And could I ask her to state categorically today that no matter what happens, implementation period will end at the end of December 2020? And would you also agree with me that to go into any negotiation saying that you will never walk away is not the way to go into a negotiation to get the best interest?
I'm certainly agree with the Right Honourable Lady on that particular point. I've made that point in the Chamber in the past. Anybody going into a negotiation needs to be able to take that position. On the question of the end date for the implementation period, of course, I'd spoken about it being around 2 years. In the negotiations, the European Union wanted it to be at December 2020, and I felt it was appropriate that we had that firm date so that everybody is clear about when that implementation period will end.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
For understandable reasons, defence has more than halved as a proportion of GDP since the end of the Cold War. Now that the threat from Russia is re-emerging, can we reassess the need to fill the holes in the defence budget identified by the NAO, by the Defence Select Committee and most recently by the Joint Committee on the National Security Strategy.
Can I say to my honourable friend, this is obviously an issue on which he has campaigned and continues to campaign with great passion and dedication. As he will know, coming out of the National Security Capability Review, we have set up the Modernising Defence programme. We are looking carefully at the question of our future defence against the background of the threats that we face. But of course, defence and national security covers more than simply what would traditionally be regarded as defence, but we are looking carefully at the capabilities required by the Ministry of Defence.
It is the Right Honourable Gentleman Member for Leeds Central who has migrated backwards from his usual seat. But only a temporary move. Indeed. Mr. Hilary Benn.
The United Kingdom is a world leader in aerospace defence and satellite systems. Can the Prime Minister clarify whether the attempts that the EU Commission is apparently making to freeze British companies out of Galileo contracts that are due to be issued in June is consistent with the transitional arrangements or not? And if not, what does she propose to do about it?
I say to the Right Honourable Gentleman that we have been very clear that as long as we're a member of the European Union, we will meet our obligations as a member of the European Union, but we should continue to be treated as a full member of the European Union. The Business Secretary has, as the Business Secretary has said, the UK does have a world-leading space sector that has contributed a significant amount of specialist expertise to the Galileo programme. So we believe it is not just a question of what's in the UK's interest for us to continue to be able to participate as we have done in that programme. We think it's actually in the interest of the European Union as well, because of the expertise the United Kingdom can provide.
Nicky Morgan.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate the Prime Minister on the implementation period agreed last week? It's something that businesses have been calling for and provides with much needed certainty. But one of the things that they are still saying is that they want to know that there will be regulatory forbearance, understanding by regulators during that implementation period as they adjust to a new set of rules. Is that something that ministers are also aware of and have been discussing?
I thank my right honourable friend for that question. Yes, we are aware of the issue of the stance of the regulators and have been in discussion with certain regulators about how they can be working with their European opposite numbers to ensure that there is a sound regulatory footing during that implementation period.
Mr. Nigel Dodds.
Mr. Speaker, can I associate my party with her words on the courage and sacrifice of Lieutenant Colonel Beltram and also her very appropriate words on the Russian threat? In relation to the backstop provisions, does she share the bemusement of many in Northern Ireland that there is so much concentration on this so-called backstop when we should be getting on negotiating the overall agreement which will actually take care of the Irish border issue? And would she share my view that there are many in Northern Ireland who are also concerned that this has been used by some in the European Union and indeed in the Irish government to shape their version of Brexit or indeed to thwart Brexit altogether, inventing problems when there are none? So will she give a clear assurance to the people of Northern Ireland that there will be no backtracking on her firm resolve that no British Prime Minister could ever sign up to the sort of legal text that the EU put forward?
Well, I thank the right honourable gentleman for his comments, and I'm absolutely clear, and I share with him the bemusement that actually so much focus is being put on Plan C, when all parties have clearly said that we want to achieve this through what was Plan A in the joint report, which was, of course, the overall agreement between the United Kingdom and the European Union on its future partnership. And I'm happy to confirm that not only I, but I don't think it would be possible for anybody standing here at this dispatch box to support something which destroyed the UK internal market. But we're very clear that we maintain our commitment to the whole of the December joint report, but we will be working on those options, and we are fully confident that we can find a solution through Plan A.
Mr. Damien Green.
There were many positive aspects of the Council for which my right honourable friend deserves congratulation, including particularly the unanimous support from other European countries over Russia's appalling behaviour, showing our European friends are considerably more robust than the leadership of the opposition. Does she agree that today's welcome moves on expelling Russian diplomats from a number of countries must not be a one-off, but must be seen as the start of a more robust strategy in resisting Putin's provocation wherever it occurs.
Well done.
Say to my right honourable friend that I absolutely agree, and I think this is why, as I said earlier, EU foreign ministers will be looking at this issue again, and the EU Council will be looking at this issue again. What happened in Salisbury was part of a pattern of aggressive Russian behaviour, and we need to ensure that we are working across all fronts to deal with that aggressive behaviour, whether it's disinformation, propaganda, cyber attacks. We need to be working together to deal with all of those threats.
Bradshaw. Can I congratulate her for the level of support and solidarity she secured on Russia from our European friends? But can I ask the Prime Minister, how is it remotely acceptable that when a young whistleblower exposes compelling evidence of law-breaking by the Leave campaign implicating staff at Number 10, that one of those named, instead of addressing the allegations made, issues an officially sanctioned statement outing the whistleblower as gay and thereby putting his family in Pakistan in danger? It's a disgrace, Prime Minister.
Absolutely.
You need to do something about it.
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman that any statements issued were personal statements that were issued. There were personal statements that were issued. I, of course, recognise the importance of ensuring that we do recognise that for some, being outed as gay is difficult because of their family and circumstances. And what I want to see is a world where everybody is able to be confident in their sexuality and doesn't have to worry about such things.
Sir Edward Lee.
Russia respects strength, and one of the lessons of the 1930s is that it's dangerous to give commitments to Eastern Europe unless you back that commitment up with military hardware. Our commitment to the Baltic states is relatively modest, I think 800 men in the Baltic states. Will the Prime Minister consider increasing our military commitment and our support of the Baltic states so that we can build European solidarity built on a coalition of peace through security?
I'd say to my honourable friend that we do look constantly, obviously, at the contribution that we are making. He's right that we have several hundred troops in Estonia as part of the enhanced forward presence. We also, of course, are contributing in other parts of Europe to the work that is being done, for example, in Poland. But obviously, we continue to look at this.
Angela Eagle.
Mr. Speaker, Prime Minister, given that your political secretary, Stephen Parkinson, was the person that's responsible for outing the Vote Leave whistleblower using Number 10 paper and documents, what are you, Prime Minister, going to do? You should sack him.
No, I'm sorry, that is not what I should be doing. And my political secretary does a very good job as my political secretary. And as I have said, any statements that have been made were personal statements.
Sir Desmond Swain.
Were we to adopt his policy of domestic procurement preference, wouldn't that be a passport to ruin?
Can I say to my right honourable friend that I welcome his way with words in his question, and I think he's absolutely right. As my right honourable friend, the Immigration Minister, said earlier this afternoon, what we want to ensure is that we're giving, we're providing a secure document, good value for the taxpayer, and that we as a government believe in competition and open markets.
Joanna Cherry.
Mr. Speaker, it's been very reassuring to see the other EU member states rally to the United Kingdom's support on the issue of Russia. Does she agree that all member states, and indeed the UK, should be vigilant against human rights abuses wherever they occur, even when that is within an EU member state itself?
Absolutely.
Can I say to the honourable lady that, of course, in the European Union, we all stand up for certain values, for European values. Human rights are within those values that we stand up for, and where any difference is shown by any individual country in relation to that, then that is something that is pointed out.
Mr. Mark Francois.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister share my incredulity at the crocodile tears of the SNP over fishing when they would have us remain in the disastrous CFP in the first place? But can I go on to ask her about the suggestion last week from my honourable friend from Berwick about a mitigation scheme to protect our fishermen during the transition period? Has any thought been given to that in government, and might we see something about it in the forthcoming fisheries bill?
Can I share the incredulity that my honourable friend has in relation, my right honourable friend has in relation to the actions of the SNP, who would keep us in perpetuity in the common fisheries policy. We are, of course, we'll be talking with the fishing industry about the arrangements that will pertain for the industry in future. I want to see that industry enhanced. I want to see us able to see us doing what we can to ensure that when we, at the end of that implementation period, when we have been negotiating as an independent coastal state in relation to fishing and access to our waters and our fishermen's access to other waters, that we are able to see an industry that can be enhanced and built on and can grow and provide even greater support here in the United Kingdom.
Well, Leslie.
Why is the Prime Minister so attached to the reckless strategy of taking the UK past exit day without settling a treaty on the future relationship that we would have with the EU? She could call that 21-month period an additional negotiation period or a limbo period, but she really shouldn't call it an implementation period, because there may be nothing to implement.
Gentlemen, if he looks back at my statement, he will recall that I said that it is our intention that this House, when it comes to look at the withdrawal agreement and implementation bill and to vote on that bill, should have sufficient detail of what that future relationship is going to be, and that will take place. That will take place before we leave the European Union.
Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of us are concerned that in the transition period most of the red lines have gone, but can live with it on the basis that they will be restored when we finally leave. What reassurance can my right honourable friend give me that when we leave we will be out of the single market, out of the customs union, out of any jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice?
Hear, hear. Well, can I say to my honourable friend that I'm happy to reiterate what I have said before, that we will be leaving the single market, we will be leaving the customs union, we will be leaving the common fisheries policy, we will be ensuring that we take back control of our waters. He asks me about the European Court of Justice, and we're clear that we will take back control of our laws, but with his attention to detail, my honourable friend will know that within the December joint report in relation to citizens' rights, there was, as part of that, for a period of time, for those EU citizens who are here, where cases are taken about those rights to UK courts, it will be possible for the UK courts to have due regard to the views of the European Court of Justice.
Honourable gentleman, the member for Ilford South is rocking back and forth in a state of some perturbation, and it disquiets me to see him in that situation. Let's hear the fella. Mr. Mike Gapes.
Mr. Speaker, it was reported that the Prime Minister actually stayed at the European Council meeting longer than had originally been intended. Is that a metaphor for our membership of the European Union? And given that she was there longer, did she have opportunity to have bilateral discussions with other heads of government in the margins of the meeting? If so, could she tell us which ones?
Well, I had, can I say to the honourable gentleman that I did indeed stay overnight, and the reason for this was, I believe, a very good one, which I think everybody in this House would support, which was we had expected to discuss the steel and aluminium tariffs imposed by the United States and the position of the European Union on Thursday night. It became clear that the decision of the President of the United States was not going to come through until the early hours of the morning in European time, and that trade would therefore be discussed on the next day. And in order to speak up for UK steelworkers, I stayed on.
Anna Soubry.
Can I commend the Prime Minister for her statement today? Mr. Speaker, it was noticed by many people that our European Union colleagues and allies acted more quickly in support of the Prime Minister's firm and fully proper actions against Russia, more quickly than the President of the United States. What what guarantees can she give us? What confidence can she give us that we will continue to have that great relationship with our fellow members of the European Union once we've left the European Union?
I say to my right honourable friend that the United States has, of course, today announced the expulsion of 60 Russian diplomats, that we do, as part of the implementation period agreement, as she will be able to see, we have come to an agreement as to how we are going to operate on our common foreign policy and foreign policy issues during the period of the implementation period. But it is certainly the case that we continue to be part of Europe. As I've said, we're leaving the EU, we're not leaving Europe. And we will continue to work closely with our allies across Europe in a variety of fora, including, and not least, with the United States as well in NATO.
I warmly welcome the robust attitude that Europe has adopted towards Russia, and indeed I warmly commend the Prime Minister on securing it, because I don't think that that was a small feat. But can I just make a suggestion to her about dealing with Russia, which is that we should do more to tackle the dirty Russian money that is sloshing around in the City of London. And one thing that could be easily done, the government has, quite rightly, introduced a register of beneficial ownership of trusts, but it's refusing to make that public. Isn't now the time to make sure that everybody knows who owns what in this country, and that Russian dirty money will not swill around in this country, because we're a clean city corporation, and we're going to make everything public?
To the right honourable gentleman, that we don't want to see dirty money, whatever its source, here in the City of London or in the United Kingdom, and that's why we have taken a number of steps to enhance our ability to deal with that issue. It's why the National Crime Agency will always act where there are issues around criminal activity or illicit finances. It's why we have brought proposals forward in the Criminal Finances Act, which gave us even greater strength, and it's why, of course, we will be dealing with what the other issue he's always raised with me in the past, the Magnitsky issue in the sanctions bill.
Mr. Richard Drax.
Speaker, does my right honourable friend agree that we live in an increasingly dangerous world and that our European allies and friends must be persuaded to spend more on defence?
When I say to my honourable friend, he knows that we, of course, meet our NATO commitment of spending 2% of GDP on defence, and we regularly encourage others to meet their commitment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The steps that have been taken on Russia, and indeed the steps that were taken on steel, given the steel industry in my own constituency. But does she not recognise there is a complete paradox here? At the very time that she is talking about the need for more cooperation on Russia, more cooperation on steel, more cooperation on data, more cooperation on counter-terrorism, her government is pursuing a reckless, hard Brexit. And would you not agree with me that as the facts change, as people see these changing contexts, that the people have the right to change their mind?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman that leaving the European Union does not mean we are leaving Europe. As I have just said in response to my right honourable friend, we are very clear we will continue to work with our European allies on issues of mutual interest and mutual concern, and where we're dealing with threats that are posed to both those countries and to the United Kingdom. We will do so in a variety of ways, as I've said, not least within NATO.
Speaker, those who doubted the Conservative Party's ability under the leadership of the Prime Minister to negotiate with the European Union will surely welcome today's agreement both on the implementation phase and on the bulk of the future withdrawal agreement. And notwithstanding the mantra that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, would my right honourable friend do all possible to share the details of the agreement on citizens' rights to both European nationals here in the UK and British citizens in the European Union as soon as possible?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that question. We have made efforts in the past to do exactly that, but we will be looking to ensure that we can provide the maximum information possible to EU citizens living here and UK citizens living in the European Union about their rights, about their position, so they can have certainty.
Hobhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The ability of signing our own trade agreements with third countries is hailed as one of the big Brexit prizes. Delegations from EFTA countries who can agree their own free trade agreements, when asked what they make of their freedom, say they follow what the EU is doing. With which third countries does she expect the UK will make trade agreements different and better from current EU trade agreements
during the transition period or indeed afterwards?
To the Honourable Lady, that it is of course not the case that the European Union has trade agreements with every country that we might wish to have trade agreements with. But more than that, there are a number of countries that do have trade agreements with the European Union. We've discussed being able to move those over into a bilateral relationship at the point of our leaving. But also, what I have seen when I talk with those countries is a desire to go further than that and to improve the agreements that we have with those countries.
Sir Alistair Jack.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that our fishing rights must not be hardwired into any future trade deal?
Yeah. Can I say to my honourable friend, I recognise the concern that there was at the time when we went into the common fisheries policy about the way in which the matter of our fishing rights had been dealt with, and I can assure him that we will be looking to deal in a very different way with our fishing in the future.
Mr. Speaker, would the Prime Minister agree with me that in the just over 20 months since the referendum, thanks to sessions like this, the British public is much better informed about the costs and benefits of leaving the European Union, particularly the dangers to our security and our economy? Given that they're much better educated about Europe and the threats, shouldn't we have another vote now that we know what the cost really is?
No.
James Cleverly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the response to the Salisbury attack from our friends and allies in the European Union not only shows that she still has a huge degree of standing amongst our European friends, but also bodes well for a pragmatic and mutually beneficial conclusion to these Brexit negotiations?
I thank my honourable friend. I have to say, I think that not only the way in which other EU members have supported the United Kingdom and taken action in relation to Russia, but also the fact that we achieved the December joint report, that we've achieved the agreement of considerable amounts of the withdrawal agreement and the implementation period, I think does indeed bode well for our future negotiations.
Reynolds.
I welcome the Prime Minister's commitment that the UK will remain in the European arrest warrant. Could she be clear, however, how the joint jurisdiction is going to take place and what will be the role for the European Court in the application of that arrest warrant?
Well, can I say that we, as we have put in a number of proposals, we need to ensure that once we've left the European Union, we recognise the sovereign legal order of the United Kingdom, and obviously we recognise the legal order that will pertain for the EU 27. We will, of course, be negotiating the details of issues like the European arrest warrant as part of the security partnership and treaty that we will be negotiating for the future.
Oh, bless you. You're a gentleman. Bless you. Stephen Hammond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I commend my right honourable friend on the progress she made last week. And she will know that the financial services industry particularly welcome the implementation period. And they will also particularly welcome in the guidelines the commitment for a trade in services based on market access and allowing rights of establishment. Is it the British Government's ambition to achieve that under mutual recognition or standards regulatory alignment?
There have been a number of proposals that have been brought forward as to the basis on which we could have that recognition of standards on both sides. Of course, there are some aspects of the financial services sector where standards are sent internationally, not just at the European Union level. I think as part of the detailed negotiations we'll be going into, we'll be looking at exactly what a sort of dynamic equivalence of standards might look like in the future.
Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The 23rd of March European Council guidelines state clearly that being outside the customs union and the single market will inevitably lead to frictions in trade. Does that sentence not confirm beyond all doubt that the Prime Minister's red lines are leading us inexorably to a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic?
It does not. Of course, the European Union will have set their particular guidelines. We are going into negotiation with them. We've already set out ways in which we can ensure there is no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, and we're going to go into detailed discussions on those.
Mr. David Jones.
I congratulate my right honourable friend on the progress made thus far in the withdrawal negotiations, but can she confirm that it remains her position that no deal is better than a bad deal, and that all necessary preparations are being made for such an eventuality?
Yes, I can assure my right honourable friend that we are ensuring that we are preparing for all eventualities.
Kirsty Blackman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Mr Speaker, what does the Prime Minister think the effect will be on GDP of the UK leaving the EU?
Well, can I say to the honourable lady that what I expect to happen as a result of us leaving the European Union, I believe that we will be able to continue to trade on a very good basis with the European countries of the European Union, but we'll also be able to sign trade deals around the rest of the world. And the impact on the GDP of this country is not just about our membership of the European Union, it's about the steps this government is taking through the modern industrial strategy and other, which is why we see record levels of employment in this country and continuous growth for some period of time.
Yes. Oh, bless you, you too. Derek Thomas.
It is welcome that the implementation period will create confidence for British business, all except perhaps for the UK fishing industry. UK fishing must be given confidence and must be prepared. Does the Prime Minister and the Chancellor plan to build this confidence by investing in our fishing fleet, improving the infrastructure of our ports and ensuring we have the adequate fishing producing facilities in the UK by 2021?
Prime Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for that, and I know the obviously particularly constituency interest that he has in this issue. Can I reassure him that what we will be doing, the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, will be consulting with the fishing industry, working with them, with fishermen and indeed with fish processors, to ensure that we get the best possible possibilities for enhancing and building on our fishing industry for the future.
And Mr David Hanson.
If a lorry laden with goods from Ireland or from the European Union leaves Dublin and drives through the frictionless border to Belfast and joins a ferry to Liverpool and drives 20 miles to my constituency and unloads, in the absence of a customs union or a single market, how will my constituents know what's in the lorry?
Well, can I say to the right honourable gentleman that the idea that the only way in which there can be reasonable and sensible arrangements for crossing the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland is by us remaining in the customs union and in the single market is simply wrong.
Jeremy Lefroy.
Mr. Speaker, may I congratulate my right honourable friend and the Secretary of State and their teams for the progress that's been made. Can she, in the next stages of the negotiation, pay particular interest to young people in this country who, for the last 20 or 30 years, have been able to work and study across the European Union without hindrance? Can we ensure that, even given the red lines, that they will be able to continue to do so, and indeed all people in this country, at least for a limited period of time, 2, 3, 4 years, without having to get work permits?
Well, yes, I'm very clear that people from the United Kingdom will continue to want to work and study in EU 27 countries, and EU citizens will continue to want to come and work and study here in the United Kingdom. And we will be looking at some of the specific arrangements that have, for example, helped to support students. So we will be looking at Erasmus and whether we should continue to be involved in programmes like that.
Neil Gray.
The Prime Minister mentioned the Brexit referendum. How concerned is she by, and does she support investigations into reports that the Vote Leave campaign may have broken campaign spending limits in that referendum?
The question of whether rules were followed in the referendum is a matter for the Electoral Commission. I do refer to the Brexit referendum because the people of the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union, and that's what we're going to deliver for them.
Giles Watling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that when this country is threatened by actions and stances that we've seen recently from Russia, this House should be united against these stances, as it's the only way that democracy can defeat despotism?
I agree with my honourable friend. I think it's important that across this whole House we show our unity in standing up to the threat and behaviour of Russia.
Mr. Speaker, the coordinated expulsions are welcome and highly significant. Is she prepared to take further action if the government concludes that Nikolai Glushkov was murdered with the involvement of the Russian Federation just 8 days after the Skripal attack in London in mysterious circumstances?
Prime Minister.
What I would say to the honourable gentleman is obviously there's an ongoing investigation by the police into the death of that individual, and we obviously await to see what the result of that investigation will be.
Kate.
Speaker, expanding on the comments made or the question raised by my honourable friend, the member for Dumfries and Galloway, does my right honourable friend agree that any such free trade agreement that's linked to a specific industry such as fishing not only constitutes something that the fishing communities could not find acceptable, but actually constitutes cherry-picking?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend, as I said in response to our honourable friend, the member for Dumfries and Galloway, that obviously I'm aware of the fact of the way in which the fishing industry felt it was treated and was dealt with in relation to the United Kingdom entering the European common market as it was then. I'm also very clear that as we leave the European Union, we need to ensure that we are upholding the interests of the fishing industry, not just upholding the interests of the fishing industry, but actually, as I've said to a number of other honourable friends, that we're giving the fishing industry an opportunity to rebuild and to be enhanced for the future.
Hannah Bardell.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. Given that her government and unfortunately the official opposition have had more positions on Brexit than the Kama Sutra, isn't it time that I had this idea first nonsense stopped, and that she and her government spelled out how our constituents will be protected from the disastrous economic impacts of Brexit?
Can I say to the honourable lady that the picture she paints is not one that I recognise? Indeed, in relation to anything that she said in her question.
Well, I don't know whether the honourable lady was preparing to divulge further information, but I'm not sure it would be entirely seemly in the context of these exchanges today. Chris Philp.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate the Prime Minister on the progress made last week, once again confounding the naysayers and the doom-mongers. Can I also welcome her comment on page 5 about the need for clarity on the terms of the final trade agreement by October. But could I ask the Prime Minister how we can avoid the risk that we end up signing a legally binding exit agreement before we sign a legally binding final state free trade agreement, given that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed?
Of course, there is a legal difference in both of these agreements, because it is not possible to legally sign the new free trade agreement until we're outside the European Union, whereas, of course, the withdrawal agreement will have to go through Parliament and through the European Parliament prior to us leaving the European Union. But as I said, and as my honourable friend has alluded to, it is important that we have sufficient detail on that future relationship, agreed detail on that future relationship, so that everybody knows what it's going to be at the time at which they are asked to look at the withdrawal agreement.
Liz McInnes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Prime Minister's comments on Gibraltar, but can she say what specific discussions have taken place regarding the future of Gibraltar International Airport?
Well, yes, I can say to the honourable lady that we are obviously discussing with the Government of Gibraltar, but we're also, discussions are taking place to ensure that the challenges that are posed by the relationship between Gibraltar and Spain, including in relation to the airport, are overcome, and some good discussions have been held so far.
Simon Hoare.
Speaker, through her, could I put on record my thanks to those NHS staff who cared for my constituent Nick Bailey so well, and to advise the House that the whole community of Alderholt, the village of which Nick lives in, is very grateful for that and pleased with the progress that he is making. It was clearly a very busy council that my right honourable friend attended. During those conversations on the margin, was she able to raise at any point with other European leaders the rather ugly rise in the scourge of anti-Semitism in Europe?
That was not an issue which I raised in this European Union Council. However, I would join my friend in his disquiet at the rise that we see of anti-Semitism, not just, of course, across the European continent, but sadly we see too many examples of anti-Semitism here in the United Kingdom. There is no place for any racial hatred, for hate crime or for hate speak, be it Islamophobia or anti-Semitism here in the UK.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week's decision to stay in the CFP and have no say in the matter for the next 21 months is further vindication of decades-long contempt for the fishing industry. Now, last week, Niels Weikman of the Danish Fishers Association said that Britain has never ever challenged the quota shares that we have used every year in annual negotiations. If the Tories are so concerned about the fishing industry, why have they never challenged the quotas?
Can I just say to the honourable gentleman, he talks about the common fisheries policy as showing decades-long contempt for the British fishing industry, but it's the Scottish Nationalist Party that wants to stay in the common fisheries policy and show such contempt.
Mr Peter Aldous.
Mr Speaker, Brexit provides a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for there to be a renaissance of East Anglian fishing, though the provisions of the implementation agreement have created both anger and also some doubt as to whether the government share the ambition of the industry locally. Will my right honourable friend confirm that her government will work with and support East Anglian fishing communities such as that in Lowestoft as they work to revive this great industry?
I'm happy to confirm to my honourable friend that we will be working with those who are involved in the fishing industry around the whole of the United Kingdom to ensure that we can rebuild that industry and that it will have a very good future.
Rachel Maskell.
Mr Speaker, I've listened very carefully to the Prime Minister today, in fact since her appointment, and yet she has failed to set out exactly how we can have frictionless trade over the Irish border. So could she do that for us now?
Yeah. Not only has the government set it out, we've set it out in papers that were published last year, and I suggest the Honourable Lady looks at those.
Andrea Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As the Prime Minister is aware, my son Clifford was born the 29th of March last year, the day we triggered Article 50. For this year's party, besides a Paddington cake, I've only ordered one cake, but next year I'll be buying two. One to celebrate my son's birthday and the other to celebrate leaving the European Union. I'd like to congratulate the Prime Minister on her excellent leadership in getting us to this stage. And next year, can I save her a slice of Victoria sponge to celebrate Brexit Day?
I'd be very happy to celebrate Brexit Day with my honourable friend and indeed with Clifford.
Mr Kevin Brennan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Prime Minister knows that under the single origin principles that most broadcasters in the European Union choose to licence within the UK. I met one such last week who told me they will be moving 700 jobs from the UK either to Dublin, to Amsterdam or to Luxembourg, and will be doing so before the implementation period she talked about. Is this what her right honourable friend, the member for Woking, meant by the Brexit bonus, and what's she going to do about it?
If the honourable gentleman looks at the speech that I gave in Mansion House on the future economic partnership, broadcasting was one of the issues that I touched on there in terms of a specific strand of the negotiations that we want to entail. Of course, there are some broadcasters who are broadcasting here into the UK who have been licensed in the European Union because of the freedoms that are available at the moment. We recognise there will be some change to the arrangements in the future, but we want to ensure that we can indeed maintain that strength in broadcasting that we have here.
Morris.
Can I welcome the Prime Minister's statement today? In particular, would she agree with me that what my constituents now want in the Black Country and the West Midlands is for us to move quickly to the substantive negotiations about what our future trading relationship is going to be with the European Union, so that we can build on the positive developments in the regional economy and take advantage of the opportunities for exporting and opening up trade links throughout the world?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. I'm sure that the people in the Black Country and in the West Midlands, and indeed those views are shared by people across the United Kingdom, want to see us moving to those negotiations for the future relationship and seeing the benefits that will come once we're able to negotiate our own trade deals and encourage exporting outside the European Union.
Speaker, may I strongly advise the Prime Minister she actually, before commenting on it, reads SNP fishing policy, because she has it spectacularly wrong. And could the Prime Minister explain to the fishing communities of my Argyll and Bute constituency why she's agreed to a deal that keeps them in the CFP without a voice? And isn't it the worst possible deal her government could have achieved for our fishing communities?
Absolutely.
To the honourable gentleman, as he will know, what will happen is that for the 2019 catch, we will of course still be a member of the European Union and part of those negotiations. For the 2020 catch, we will be consulted on that, and the stability key, the quota, will not change. And then for the 2021 catch, we will be negotiating as an independent coastal state. And if he's saying that the SNP has changed its policy in relation to being a member of the Common Fisheries Policy, then I'm very interested to hear it. But so far as I'm aware, they haven't. He needs to talk to his front bench.
Nigel Huddleston.
Speaker, I'm pleased to hear the Prime Minister's continuing support for free trade. Is she aware that De La Rue currently exports to over 140 countries, exports passports to over 40 countries, and does she therefore agree with me that the biggest threat to British jobs at De La Rue would be to advocate policies that would restrict passport production to home countries only?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. Those who say that passports can only be produced in their home country would be denying De La Rue a significant part of its business.
West. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The European Medicines Agency is departing these shores for the Netherlands. What estimate has the Treasury made of future losses for British science and research, particularly medical research?
As the honourable lady may know, within the Mansion House speech that I gave a few weeks ago, I raised the question of our future relationship with the European Medicines Agency and some other agencies, and we are wanting to discuss with the European Union the possibility of an associate membership, crucially so that entails that there only needs to be one set of authorisations, and we believe that's in everybody's interest in terms of getting medicines more quickly to market.
Alberto Costa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I also congratulate the Prime Minister on the very sensible agreement she's reached at the European Council? Unlike the Leader of the Opposition, can I add my personal thanks to the Prime Minister and her team for agreeing a very sensible outcome during the implementation period for EU nationals in our country, as well as UK citizens in the EU 27. Given my deep interest in this subject, which the Prime Minister knows well, can she help facilitate a meeting with the Secretary of State so I understand the proposed settlement rules that the Secretary of State will be in due course drafting?
Yes, I'm very, very happy to do that. I think it's important that those rules are clear for those who have been campaigning particularly on this issue, and I'm sure that that meeting will take place.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do wonder, Mr. Speaker, if at the European Council the Prime Minister was able to ask the President of France, who on a recent state visit to India managed to secure a trade bill in the value of $16 billion, despite the dead weight of the European Union on its back.
Well, I can say I did indeed have discussions with the President of France, but we were discussing other issues, such as how we dealt with the threat from Russia.
Cartledge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my right friend's statement on the Salisbury incident on the 14th of March, she said, Britain does not stand alone against Russia. And we should remember that there were those who questioned that at the time, questioning whether some of our allies really believed the evidence that they were shown. So surely what is so significant about today is not only that we're very far from being alone, but that those countries can clearly see the culpability of the Kremlin in this terrible attack.
My honourable friend is absolutely right. That was reflected in the conclusions of the European Council that took place on Thursday and Friday of last week, and it's been reflected in the actions that have been taken by a number of EU countries, actions which are, of course, not just about supporting the United Kingdom, but I believe are in the interest of the national security of those countries themselves.
Dr. Rupa Hart.
Mr. Speaker, it is pleasing to see unanimity behind the Prime Minister with our EU partners in the recognition that the shocking events in Salisbury were in fact made in Russia. But among the actions that we now take, could she please revisit the golden ticket visas, the Tier 1 investor visas? 2,500 oligarchs have acquired them in less than 10 years. Would she commit to at least strengthening the checks on the wealth behind these so that accusations of rich Russians buying their way into Britain with dirty money simply cannot stick?
My right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, has in hand a review of that particular tier of investor visas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our scientists at Porton Down played a crucial role in our response to Russian actions in Salisbury. Will my right honourable friend join me in paying tribute to them and continue to support and invest in our cyber, scientific and security personnel, whose role in our defence has never been more important?
Well, I'm very happy to join my honourable friend in paying tribute to our scientists at Porton Down and in the particular defence organisation in its various places, but also to recognise the Ministry of Defence has recently announced that there will be some enhancement of the capabilities at Porton Down, and it is important that we continue to do that and enhance our cyber capabilities, as we have with the nearly £2 billion we're putting into our national cyber security.
Stuart C. MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's surely not good enough for the UK or indeed other EU states to hide behind the Spanish Constitution if that Constitution allows for fundamental rights and freedoms and democracy to be trampled all over. Is the Prime Minister seriously saying that however many arrests occur and however many people are locked up simply for expressing their democratic views, the EU and the UK will say absolutely nothing about it?
I've said all along, as I've repeated earlier in in this House. We believe that it's important that the Spanish Constitution is upheld and the rule of law is upheld.
Drew Hendry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister is right in stressing the importance of standing up for shared values, as she says, on this continent and beyond. That being the case, what does she think of politicians being arrested in Catalonia to suppress the peaceful democratic process?
As I have just said in answer to one of his honourable friends, I continue to, and will continue to say, we believe that the Spanish Constitution should be upheld, and we believe that the rule of law should be upheld.
Yes, Chris Law.
Last but not least, has the Prime Minister spoken with her Spanish counterpart about the need to uphold democracy in Catalonia? And if not, will she do so shortly?
Can I say I have conversations I have had on a number of occasions in the past with the Spanish Prime Minister have been our reassurance that we believe that the Spanish Constitution and the rule of law should be upheld.
Thank you. I'm most grateful to the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, and the 63 colleagues from the backbenches who questioned the Prime Minister. If others from the front bench would follow this textbook, we would get through lots of questions with commendable speed. So I'm sure other ministers will be taking notice of these important exchanges.
I've been